Hi, I'm David Judson, Editor-in-Chief of Stratfor. With me today is Adriano Bosoni, our Chief Analyst in Europe. You haven't been here in Austin since April, I guess. But in the interim, you've been a traveling man. Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Ireland, Luxembourg, Poland, Greece, and Turkey from your base in Frankfurt. We were earlier talking today about the dilemmas of immigration and integration, both for sending countries and receiving countries, because there's a lot going on right now. Can you amplify on that a bit?
Yeah, it's interesting when you go to places like Portugal or Spain or Greece, you notice that there aren't that many young people. And at the same time, when you arrived at the airport in Frankfurt, which is the main airport in the main economy of Europe, you see lots of Portuguese, Greeks, or Spaniards coming back home in Germany after visiting their families in the periphery. So we are seeing this process that because of the European crisis, countries that traditionally were countries of emigration, like Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Greece, are returning to that situation of countries of emigration, which in the short run, it helps them cope with the crisis because you have fewer people competing for jobs, fewer people applying for unemployment benefits, more people sending remittances back home, which helps their families at home. But in the long run, it creates problems because it worsens an already difficult demographic situation, and you have fewer people paying taxes, fewer people working.
Well, but can we try and look at it from this perspective? I mean, we talk a lot about the European project. That's your analytical life in many ways, and the idea of European integration. And we saw the sort of Jean Monnet, Schuman, Spinelli vision until 2006 with Erasmus programs, and people were going to jettison their national identities and or make them sub-identities to the emergence of this grand European identity. That's one kind of integration. Now we see integration going on, or at least immigration going on, but it's driven by a negative rather than a positive vision. So it's stirring the European pot in new ways. Is that too extreme?
Yeah, it's a very complex process because on the one hand, immigration is helping the receiving country to deal with its demographic crisis. People in Germany, Austria are not having children, but they are getting immigrants who are entering the labor force and who are, to a certain extent, offsetting the process of population shrinking and aging. But at the same time, this creates tensions in the receiving country. You see across Europe, in core countries, in the largest economies in the bloc, from the United Kingdom to Germany, this resistance and this political movement criticizing the free movement of people, criticizing people stealing jobs, people unfairly applying for welfare benefits. So it's a double-edged sword, right. I would argue.
Yeah. So I mean, there are legitimate problems and legitimate reasons surely to object. I mean, I understand, but this growing resistance is the best word I can come up with against Muslims, against Romanians in Western Europe, against the Roma. We've seen the emergence of far-right movements and some pretty unpleasant things going on. Is this likely to get worse?
Well, what we see in Europe is that the whole political spectrum has moved to nationalism.
Right.
Moderate parties, center-right parties have moved to the right, and nationalist parties are emerging from the National Front in France to UKIP in the United Kingdom. And there's this common theme of anti-immigration sentiment. When people have lost their jobs or are afraid of losing their jobs, then the rhetoric blaming that crisis on immigrants becomes more appealing. And since countries in Europe cannot, at this point, block European citizens from arriving, what they are doing is trying to put additional barriers or bureaucratic limits to those people arriving. And we think that Europe is slowly moving in that direction. We will see the free movement of people increasingly challenged in Europe.
Okay, but you've talked and you've written about the centrifugal versus the centripetal forces that the nationalist parties often agree that they don't like immigrants, but they don't agree on much else. That you've got a very different dynamic in the emerging nationalist groups, say in Southern Europe, versus those in Finland or the Scandinavian countries. Can we dissect that a little bit?
Well, what we see, I agree with you that these parties do not necessarily like each other, and we saw that UKIP, the National Front, had problems creating an alliance at the European Parliament, but they have an underlying theme that is common, which is the gap, the growing gap between the traditional elites that built the European Union and voters. Voters no longer feel represented by those old elites, and they are turning to protest parties, anti-system parties, and to a certain extent anti-immigration and nationalist parties.
So the elites in Europe are in trouble.
Yes, they are, and this is what ultimately will challenge the survival of the European Union in its current form.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that. That's a profound thought to ponder, but we'll come back and explore these topics in further detail. Thank you, Adriano.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here at Stratfor.